Welcome back to the podcast show, everybody. It's your host, John Scardino. We're so happy to be here. September 18th, we're going to be talking about earthquakes. It's National Preparedness Month, so it's a perfect time to talk about that. Amanda Siok, she has so much experience in earthquakes and community planning and talking about tsunamis, the whole deal up there in FEMA Region 10. She has tons of experience, and so we're happy to have her on here. Amanda, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, John. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're really excited to have you on, like we said, and to get you to kind of talk about those experiences. But just for our listeners' sake, when I found your name and some of those mutual connections, you were calling yourself, and I don't know if you were given this nickname, Leslie Knope of Earthquakes. So why did you choose to focus on more of that policy side of the house, dealing with earthquakes?
Yeah, well, for starters, the title Leslie Knope of Earthquakes was I gave myself. It kind of started as a joke. So Beyonce of Earthquakes was already taken. I don't know if you are familiar with Lucy Jones, Dr. Lucy Jones out of California. She was with USGS. She's a seismologist. She's done an amazing job distilling scientific information and communicating it to the public about earthquakes. She started her own podcast recently. She has a book. I actually have it right here called
Awesome.
The Big Ones. And there's actually on my LinkedIn, she actually I met her back in March, right before COVID. And she actually signed my book for me, and I totally had a fangirl moment. But she's often interviewed in California after earthquakes, and she's cited by the media as the Beyonce of earthquakes. And I can't compete with Beyonce.
That's hilarious.
But I have a lot of strong personality parallels with Leslie Knope of Parks and Rec, and I'm incredibly enthusiastic about mitigating earthquakes and want other people to be as enthusiastic about me. So when you asked about, why focus on risk and policy, I grew up in Washington State. I've, survived. I've been through many earthquakes. And I guess, Region 10 is kind of my Pawnee. Region 10 is Alaska, Washington, Idaho, and Oregon, very seismically active. We know that earthquakes can happen, and we know where they can happen, and we know what can be damaged. We have all of this data and scientific information to tell us all these things about earthquakes. And we also have the science and engineering to design for them, to build stronger infrastructure. But building for earthquakes just isn't in the forefront of our land use or our development decisions. And, I think we as humans, we often, we reshape our natural landscape to meet our economic needs. And in doing that, we kind of push, the environment, ecology, geology into the background. And it's reckless. And, I am just very passionate about, hoping that we can mitigate quicker, or before Earth decides to, throw the next big one our way.
Yeah. I mean, oh my gosh, studying earthquakes and studying natural disasters, there's so many natural disasters that have been perpetuated and, amplified because of the way that we impact within our environment. A couple really easy examples, and this is more like hurricanes, but nice. What's your dog's name?
Decided this is Zoe. She's decided that she wants to say hello.
Hi, Zoe.
Gonna push her back here.
That's awesome. That's totally staying in too. That's awesome.
Yeah, I've thought about starting like her own Instagram page because her tail always pops up in the background on videos.
You totally should, yeah. Well, hello, Zoe. We have cats. I hate cats, but we have cats. So there you go. So going back to like earthquakes and hurricanes and natural disasters kind of thought, the two easy ones that come to mind are when Louisiana got rid of their marshes and that amplified hurricanes, and now it's impacting Louisiana, so much more, and they're trying to figure out ways to put that back, including I was out there, and they had a 5-year plan to spend $20 million every 5 years to re-put sand back in that area. They're losing like a football field of land every hour, something crazy like that. I was like, that's just not sustainable. And so, talking about what you can do and mitigating and working with your environment, talking about, going back from that reckless idea to more of a sustainability idea. Why do you think that, it's kind of off the cuff, but why do you think that it's so hard for people to, especially in an earthquake-prone area, to really put in those mitigation efforts? Hi, dog. Hi,
yes, she's very affectionate. Well, I think that people. Well, for starters, it's the geologic time scale is just so different from the human time scale. I think that if I had a quarter for every time somebody said, well, it's never happened in my lifetime, or I've lived here for 30 years and it's never happened. Like that's inconsequential. It doesn't matter. Earthquakes happen on a much larger time scale. And I think that, people they think it's not going to happen to them, or they feel so distanced. They don't feel like they are part of the environment. They feel removed from it. And I think that, part of that is because of the way that we've built. We used to build, near like our big port cities now. The cities didn't used to be built up next to the port. They were moved away from them because people were more attuned with wind and rain events and flooding events. But as our ability to construct the built environment to protect ourselves from that increased, we started building closer to water, and then it was we all want these views. But when people tell me, well, there's, there hasn't been an earthquake since I've been here. In Seattle, I like to point at Mount Rainier and say, well, what do you think built that?
That's hilarious.
The mountains that we love are created by earthquakes, and to think that the processes that created those no longer exist because we're here. It just doesn't make sense. So,
that's a very wise statement, actually. Just because, I'm here now doesn't mean the processes have changed. Science doesn't change based off of your opinion, right?
Yeah. Well, so it's funny. I'm a big supporter of national parks and public lands, and I have a sticker on my water bottle that says "Keep it wild." Nice. And I love it because, and don't get me wrong, I want to keep our public lands public and keep them protected, but also just because we're here doesn't mean that those lands aren't wild anymore. The subduction zone off of the coast of Washington and Oregon is going to continue going whether we build here or not. So, it's those things are happening. And I think, really, and I'm a super nerd when it comes to geology. But when we have the big earthquake, I would really like to be able to enjoy, the raw power that is nature happening, like that mountain building processes are happening. And I'd like to not be concerned for the life and safety of my loved ones. I would rather be able to appreciate, the power of geology,
That's awesome.
That makes me sound so nerdy.
No, you know what? Hey, everybody's listening to this is probably nodding their head right now, because it's the same thing with tornadoes or any other major disaster that you can observe. If it doesn't impact people or systems, it's just cool. Like, it's really cool to look at. That's why we all
like the Weather Channel, right? It's cool to see it.
The Weather Channel. Yeah, the most exciting channel on TV. That's hilarious. Well, I think about like explosions in movies and stuff. Like, explosions in movies are always cool. And yet when it happens in real life, people are like, oh my gosh, you know? And that just shows that if it's impacting people, then it's a bigger deal, right?
Exactly.
Gender reveals, you know, reveals can be exciting or they can be super dangerous. So, yeah. So you talk about earthquakes and the awareness of earthquakes and kind of that timeline. Well, there's another problem in emergency management that I found is that, like, when I go into a contract, or I work with different agencies and they're making their plans, I'll often find like different types of flood, riverine flooding, flash flooding, you know, inundation, all the kind of different stuff that you can have. But then when I look at earthquakes, it's like the earthquake plan. And so, like, there's so many different types of earthquakes and what can be caused by those earthquakes. And so can you just kind of run through helping our listeners understand, like, the different types of earthquakes and those impacts of those earthquakes?
Yeah. Well, and I guess, and you touched on this a little bit, you know, the earthquake isn't the disaster. It's the crumbling of the built environment that is the disaster. You know, if there's an earthquake, you know, and where there's nothing, you know, we get these notices of, you know, pretty large earthquakes in Alaska fairly regularly, and you know, there's nothing up there, you know, where the earthquakes are happening. So it's like it doesn't make the news. It's not a big story because there's nothing there. So you know, it's the built environment that is really the issue when it comes to earthquakes. But you know, to your question about the different kinds of earthquakes. You know, some earthquakes happen deeper in the crust, and so those are typically your subduction zone type earthquakes. They're often larger magnitudes, but then there's also the more shallow earthquakes that can actually be more damaging, because if the earthquake is happening closer to the surface, then those seismic waves are going to be stronger. So you're going to have higher intensity. So that's often why, you know, you'll hear people say, you know, a magnitude 6, but we often refer to intensity rather than magnitude, because intensity is the level of shaking felt as opposed to the amount of energy released from that earthquake. But you can have, you know, an earthquake, I guess a good example, the Cascadia earthquake off the Washington coast, Washington, Oregon. You know, the shaking from that will be intense, but a Seattle fault earthquake, so there's a fault that runs right underneath downtown Seattle, an earthquake on that fault could potentially be more damaging to Seattle than the Cascadia earthquake, even though it would be a smaller magnitude.
Interesting.
But you know, then there's also volcanic earthquakes that can happen, and those are often, you know, smaller magnitude, but they can be very very shallow because it's you know, magma moving in chambers.
Yeah.
But then there's also the cascading effect. So a subduction zone earthquake in the ocean is likely going to result in a tsunami, whereas a crustal earthquake, you know, not in the ocean, isn't going to have a tsunami. Or the San Andreas fault, for example, rather than a subduction zone earthquake there's gonna be up and down movement. And a transform earthquake like the San Andreas, it's side to side motion. So the movie San Andreas has a big tsunami in it, and that's totally not realistic. That's not gonna happen.
Yeah. Well, that whole movie is pretty unrealistic, so yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't make it not fun to watch, though.
That's true. Yeah, you should watch it. That's awesome. So it's cool to talk to like a true expert, because when we have people come on here and they're able to talk about their expertise, you can really hear the passion. But you know, to be able to better understand that, and in terms of intensity too, like the biggest earthquake I've ever dealt with by far is the tsunami disaster in Japan, and helping out with that relief, and that was like a 9.0, and you know, that was pretty catastrophic. Obviously, 20,000 deaths, and a lot of that was, I wouldn't say a lot of that, but there was a portion of that could have been mitigated Just by the way that resources responded to that, unfortunately, we had loss of life. Mitigation is such a huge thing for earthquakes. In fact, the episode that is the 9/11 episode, we talked about how to mitigate so many of the different types of disasters out there, and some you can't. Earthquakes you really could, though, if you just had better planning, right?
Mm-hmm. Better planning and yeah, better design.
Yeah, absolutely. So whether you're an emergency manager or you're an urban planner, you're thinking about, so for example, in DC, we were looking at where to put a new facility. And so we were asked to do a hazard vulnerability assessment on different areas. If I was going to be an emergency manager and looking at risk maps and trying to understand earthquakes, again, that view is different than my 30-year perspective, a 300-year perspective, whatever. And now thinking about intensity, how do you think emergency managers should approach better understanding of risk maps?
Yeah, so honestly, my first words of advice would be to get outside and get away from your computer. I don't know how many plans I have reviewed where, they're showing all of these red dots on maps, and they're saying, this is going to be damaged, and this is going to be damaged, and it's going to be this much economic loss. But what does that actually mean for the community that you're planning for? Is that one red dot, is that a residential structure? Or is that, public housing for, multifamily, low income disadvantaged population? What happens when, there's tourists in that area? Or what happens to the homeless population? As we've seen with COVID, people with, gig-based jobs are severely impacted. So I think, data is really great to help us understand numbers and help us inform response plans. But I think we're often missing the people component with the data and the analysis that goes into these. So what if this is all red? Let's sit down and meet with our public works department and talk about the roads that we show will be damaged and the bridges, or meet with City Hall or the Department of Commerce and talk about what is going to happen to the status quo of the city if we are tourism based and our tourist season is canceled. I mean, look at the state of Alaska right now, but their primary economy is based in tourism and fishing. And fishing season from COVID has been drastically impacted, and their tourism season was canceled. And then I guess their third is oil, and we've seen the costs of oil drastically decline. So the state is really struggling right now between, COVID and earthquakes and, and data alone isn't going to show you that. So I guess I would say that emergency managers should help facilitate the planning process, come with the data, but you really need to bring in, the community planners, the public works people. Every community should have some sort of master plan or comprehensive plan describing their vision for the next 20 years and what they want to do and where they're going to grow. And, the emergency manager doesn't have that expertise, but they can certainly help facilitate if you want to achieve these growth numbers, maybe let's not put all of the new tech industry in, a highly liquefiable area in an earthquake zone. Looking at you, Amazon.
Yeah, seriously.
So, there's a big disconnect there. And then you get people moving for jobs and, they assume, well, the government wouldn't let me live here if it wasn't safe. But then there's that probability of, it's a low probability, high consequence event. So how much do we prioritize those increased costs of engineering? And I guess I do want to just preface, I'm not encouraging like extreme prepping, over designing everything here.
There's always that fine line, right?
It's always a fine line. But, I think we should be asking experts for their input.
Mm-hmm.
And, when we buy a car, the car isn't designed around the seatbelt and the airbags, but those are a component to the car that we expect to have, and we expect it to perform as, perfectly. And I think that we could certainly improve the designing and the community engagement in the design of our built environment, so that it's not engineers and developers saying, we're going to build to life safety performance levels, which is what building codes generally are. And maybe ask the community's input on, well, maybe we actually want this structure to be functional after an earthquake, and not unusable.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I was at Fort Bragg, or near Fort Bragg in Cureton, California, about a month ago, and we were camping, and I went across the bridge. It's that earthquake, or not earthquake, it's a tsunami threat zone. And when we got to the campsite, I just pulled up a map and looked at the road systems, and the only road system that was able to leave that entire area was a bridge. Well, there's 2 bridges on either side, and none of the roads that would have gone up into the mountain actually went up there. Like they stopped at the end of the neighborhood. There was no forethought about evacuation routes even. And I was like, so you want people to try to evacuate through bridges if there's a tsunami, which is accompanied by an earthquake, or the earthquake causes the tsunami, right? And so there needs to be a lot more forethought about how people are impacted. I love that points on a map analogy. There's a lot of people who work in data who, they never get beyond their computer. Like, you have to actually get out there. I think the emergency manager of the future will be much more involved in response and talking to survivors and helping people out. I really do believe that. It's just like the trend of where it's going. And that will help. But, obviously number one always, mostly is, life saving, right? There's very rare circumstances where you have to think of systems more important than life, because the immediate impact of life in this one area could, the domino effect of a system could impact, globally. You have to think about, those different levels of impact. But again, like you'll show that point on the map, 2017 wildfires. They did a bunch of points on a map. We went out there, and several of those structures that were burned were just like fake structures that they had on a shooting range. Like that doesn't mean anything. That who cares, But like when you get into the residential areas, when you get into low income, another one that came to mind was I was asked to do a theoretical on how to evacuate a town that had 110,000 people, but 10% of that were homeless. So how do you get the homeless out? And I was like, you already have a disaster because you have 11,000 people who are homeless. You want to evacuate 11,000 people in a disaster? And so there was like this argument of like, don't fight the exercise, but like, screw that, man. Like you have to think of the real problem. The real problem is taking care of this situation now. People of low income, people of lower on the socioeconomics, the list, they often get marginalized, and they are the number one reason why we have high death and disaster. So big shout out to you for just calling that out.
Well, I think, you just articulated it, I think, better than I did. And I think it's, how do I say this? Social injustices, economic disparities, those are only going to be exacerbated in a disaster. So, I've gotten very frustrated working with cities where I try and talk about earthquakes, and they go, well, right now we're just trying to deal with our homeless problem. Like, well, that is great that you're trying to deal with that, but what are you going to do with this homeless problem once the earthquake hits? And then you have, an even larger homeless problem, because you have unreinforced masonry structures, and you have tourists, and your population's going to double, and and then what if it's during COVID and you can't do mass sheltering as per your regular plan. So I think 2020 is certainly going to result in a whole lot of after actions for our community, for the emergency manager community.
I like that. You can call it our community. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. So there's a lot to learn, and I think we're really getting to see how interrelated all of the different fields are. I've done a lot of teaching, and it's funny, I feel like every few years there's a group of students that are really interested in one specific thing. When I was in grad school, everybody wanted to do either transportation planning or climate change planning. And now it seems like a lot of students really want to be involved in social justice. I'm like, well, all of these things are also, emergency management planning. So it's, social justice should be integrated into every element of planning, whether that's housing or transportation. So,
it's surprising it's not a given, right? Like these are people, like, hello, like, I just don't get it. Like, I mean, I do get it. I get why. I get politics gets involved and everything else, and money. But at the end of the day, like, a great emergency manager is also a great humanitarian. And if you take out the humanitarian piece, I mean, in my perspective, you're not very good at your job, because it's all about life-saving, life-sustaining. And what I would say is keeping dignity. There's been disasters I've been out to where no wonder people, their level of, potential PTSD is through the roof, or their stress is through the roof, because you strip everything away from people and you don't allow them to do anything, even allowing them to grab their own food, something that allows them to feel like, I'm dignified. I can be still respected. I lost my home, but I'm still here. And I think we can do a much better job on that. So, and we could do an entire episode on that. So,
we totally could. And I think I would just add that I don't know if it's the emergency manager's job to know all of the things, right? Like, so bringing in a local expert on, economic justice, or on access and functional needs, like, bring in people. Like, if you don't know enough about the subject or about the issue, bring in the person who does. And I think that's really the emergency manager's role, is to bring in the experts that do know what they're doing and help them coordinate and facilitate the response, and I would say the recovery. And also, if you can bring everybody together beforehand to incorporate disasters into community planning, then it sure makes the response better, and then it often prevents it from actually being a disaster. So it's just an event, and not something that requires FEMA or other response agencies to step in.
My brain is just going like on rapid fire right now, speaking of what we'll be doing on the end. But really great ideas that you're presenting, and I think this will cause a lot of people to think. But you mentioned after actions, and so I just want to go through talking about earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanoes, some major disasters throughout history, lessons learned that we can grab from there, and just kind of hear your perspective, if you're cool with that.
Sure.
Yeah, so let's talk about 2004 Indian Ocean disaster. What were some of the after actions from that, and some of the big points there?
Yeah, so that was, it was a magnitude 9 earthquake. It was a subduction zone earthquake. So like I said earlier, if you have a subduction zone earthquake, especially, oceanic, you're going to end up with a tsunami. There were a lot of lessons learned from that. The Indian Ocean did not have a tsunami warning system set up. And so that resulted in a lot of deaths. It was absolutely tragic. We did learn, there are some like really wonderful, heartwarming stories of people that recognized the signs of a tsunami before it happened. So, there were a couple of different tribes, native tribes in the area that through their oral histories, they had known about, when there's an earthquake, go to high ground so that
That's
you're
awesome.
not hit by the tsunami. There's also, this amazing story of this little 10-year-old girl who had just learned in like her geology class in like elementary school that, when the sea sucks out, which often happens before a tsunami occurs, when the sea sucks out, that's a precursor to a tsunami, and so you should get to high ground. And she saved, she saved like 100 people.
I actually did my.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. No, ladies first.
Oh, okay. Well, I was just gonna say, it really shows the value of public education and awareness, and how, whether it's oral histories and, communicating, like, these are the warning signs, this can happen. Public education really helps for saving lives. And I think that's a good part of preparedness. I think, there's this weird line of tension between mitigators and preparedness folks, because mitigation is not preparedness, but sometimes it is.
I feel like it should be. I don't know. We can talk about that later.
So, well, and I guess, I think preparedness is often treating a symptom in my book. So like your duck, cover, hold on for an earthquake, that's, you're preparing for the shaking, but I think mitigating is actually reducing the losses beforehand. But anyways, the public education component, I think, is, it's preparedness and mitigation. You're educating people so that you're you're mitigating loss of life. But anyways, that the 2004 Indian Ocean event, we learned the value of public education for sure. But we also learned a lot about the impacts that a tsunami can have, especially in densely populated areas. So we learned a lot about, we learned a lot about tsunami warnings and how to improve that system. We learned that we need to provide better evacuation planning, including that actually led to the creation in Washington of it's called Project Safe Haven, and it's like a community planning effort to talk about where a tsunami can go. And in Washington, you don't have a lot of high ground that's accessible from the coast. And so, through a ton of effort on the state of Washington emergency management and the University of Washington, and now FEMA is actually supporting it. But we're building vertical evacuation towers on the coast of Washington. So it's a last resort effort. But if there is nowhere to evacuate to, you can't get to high ground before the tsunami happens, there will be these structures there that you can ride out the wave in. Like, it's not going to be a pleasant experience for anybody, right, but it's better than dying in a tsunami. And then it also really jump-started some efforts in Oregon. They have some tsunami, they have a berm. So they have like this high ground that they've put trails and signage in to help, like you were talking about your trip to California, to help, guide people from the beach up to higher ground. And they've also, Oregon has, it's called the Blue Line Project. And some cities have chosen to paint the evacuation route on the road so that you can,
cool,
follow that. And this town, Cannon Beach, it's famous from Goonies. I don't know if you remember that movie.
Sweet, yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah, the big
I'm
rock
American.
in the Goonies.
Yeah, I've heard
Yeah. So they actually did, and FEMA helped them a number of years ago, but they did a tsunami fun run where they actually did like I think it was a 5K maybe, but they went from the beach. It was a run from the beach up the hill to the evacuation point where they actually have like a cache of preparedness materials or preparedness stuff. Like,
if you did it in 30 minutes, did they tell you that your life was saved? Because
they did joke around like, well, if you're, if you're under 20 minutes, then you survived.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That freaks me out, especially after like I said on Japan. So, okay, this is a random question. I got to really understand this better, but those evacuation towers, we did a hazard vulnerability assessment for the state of Washington in my master's program. And looking at all these different things and seeing those schools and those communities on the coastal regions that would be impacted by those, and then seeing those towers. After watching Japan, who has some of the best building codes on Earth, and just those buildings just being wiped out. I mean, we're talking about massive schools being wiped out. How reliable really are those towers?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thank you for asking it. The Japan event, so it gets a little technical here, but the Japan event, their vertical evacuation structures were designed for the most probable event, not for the worst case scenario. And the event that happened, that magnitude of earthquake, wasn't anticipated. They did not think an earthquake that large would ever happen. So we learned a lot about, mapping tsunamis and understanding potential inundation and, the depth and the velocity of tsunami waves from that event. And we've learned, for vertical evacuation, you should design it for the worst case scenario, not for the most probable event. And that does mean higher costs generally. But you don't want to repeat what happened in Japan. And then also a lot of the seawalls and things in Japan, unfortunately, created this mindset that people didn't need to evacuate, that they were protected by the seawalls. And Washington and Oregon are really being vocal that these evacuation towers and these reinforced buildings are last resort. If you can get out and get to high ground, that's your best effort. You don't want to be in one of these towers.
No,
it's better than nothing.
Yeah, good point. Better than nothing. It freaks me out. Just thinking about that, and man, my heart really aches for those people who live in those communities because their livelihoods, everything's based there, right? Schools, work, maybe multi-generational, whatever, building your own home, the whole deal, all those emotions, and then without proper planning or mitigating, really, there could be some catastrophic impacts.
So Japan actually had, it's really interesting. They have these, in some areas, there's these tsunami stones that are, hundreds of years old.
1,000 years old.
1,000 years old. Yeah, that say, don't build homes here, build above this. And my group of mitigators that I work with out here in Region 10, we always joke, don't put important stuff in stupid areas. And that's essentially what those tsunami stones were saying. It was like, this is not a good place, but we forget, or we think it won't happen to us. And man, we all love a good view, don't we?
Yeah, that you bring up such a good point, because I love that story, because when they built those stones and they built those walls, we were actually able to see over generations them moving further and further towards, or closer and closer towards the coast. Each generation would say I can still see the stone. Oh, it's just over the hill. Oh, it's just like this. And so, wow, talk about biggest frustration ever for an emergency manager. But we have in the United States a majority now of our population living on a coastal line, right? And it's quickly moving there. People are moving towards the coast. Maybe with the pandemic, because people don't have to live on one of these communities, maybe they'll start moving inland. I hope they don't before I sell my house.
I think, in Washington, I think it's the reverse. People are getting out of Seattle and headed out towards the coast. You cannot find a cabin or anything out there right now.
Oh my gosh.
Because if you don't have to commute in, then why not go and live in a beautiful area, right?
Yeah, and so that does bring up like, okay, don't be a doomsday prepper. You can't live near the coast, but just being aware of your specific communities like threats are so huge. And so just talking about maybe a couple other disasters. We don't want to take up too much of your time, but going through the 1964 Alaskan earthquake, I mean, that decimated the community there. A lot of problems. So what are some of the lessons learned, and I guess some of more of those impacts, because they are a little different than the Indian Ocean?
Yeah, so the 64 event was a magnitude 9.2. So I don't know if you've been paying attention, but there's a theme here. Subduction zone earthquakes cause really big earthquakes and subsequent tsunamis. So that earthquake, caused a ton of landslides, a lot of fires, tsunamis, down in Washington and Oregon and California. But we learned a ton from that event in terms of seismic design and, impact to transportation systems. The town of Valdez, Alaska was actually relocated further, I want to say it was further west.
I didn't know that.
They learned that.
You taught me something today.
Yay!
I
Valdez
feel so excited. Oh, that's awesome.
So they moved the town to a safer spot so that it wouldn't be as badly impacted from tsunamis or earthquakes. It certainly improved tsunami warning systems and helped contribute to the development of tsunami sirens and the Pacific tsunami warning system. And also, it really did instill, especially in Alaska, seismic design as a priority. So the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, the giant oil pipeline that runs through Alaska, they've actually, it's an amazing engineering project, but the pipeline is actually built in zigzags on these big rollers so that if there's an earthquake, the pipe can actually move with the earth and not rupture. And I had a meeting up in Fairbanks for work, or a training, and I drove up and took a selfie with it. And I'm such a nerd, but it's so cool that we can design for these things, and we have the science, we have the knowledge to do it. We just often don't, because it's expensive or it's going to slow the project, right? But it's also going to slow your project a lot more when the pipeline breaks and you've got a huge fire to deal with. So
that is the right answer. Yeah.
Yeah. But what's interesting is that 64 earthquake, Alaska was really gung-ho about seismic design. And then in 2018, Alaska had an earthquake at the end of November, and it didn't get a lot of press because it's Alaska, it's far away. And I think 2 days after the earthquake, President George Bush Sr. died. And so the media was like, oh, bigger news. But downtown Anchorage fared really well in that earthquake. Downtown Anchorage does a lot with building codes and building code enforcement. But, Alaska is the last frontier. You've got a lot of people that are kind of like, my property, don't tell me what to do with it. Yeah. And we found that there were a lot of residential homes that suffered significant damage because they weren't built to code. There was code, but it wasn't enforced. And it's unfortunate because
there's Zoe.
you see the tail.
Yeah.
But anyways, building residential structures to be safer in an earthquake is not that challenging to do, and there's no reason. And I mean, I think granted, I'm probably not the best person to ask, but if somebody was like, here's this house for $300,000, you can pay $325,000 and it's, earthquake resilient. Yeah, I'm going to spend the money on that. So I think, Alaska is doing some revisiting on building codes and the value of them. And, it's resulting in lawsuits against developers and things for not building properly and, suing the city for not enforcing. So it gets really political really quick. But the earthquake in Alaska in 2018, it wasn't their big one. And so the amount of damage that they had to schools and residential structures, which is, the people, sure, the city is fine, but if the employees of the city aren't safe, then the economics of the city are going to decline.
Yeah.
So, they're learning, and they're getting lots of mitigation projects going right now.
That's cool. And I'm sure FEMA's helping out a lot with that. So it's really awesome. Man, everything you say, like, I just want to make like an entire episode just about that, because like I have so many questions and ideas, and you're saying really great things here. Talk about a true expert in your field, and I really appreciate it. You're talking about Alaska and everything happening there. I think about my own family preparedness and how grateful I am to understand data and risk. Each time we've moved, I had this funny story with a realtor. A realtor came in and wanted us to look at these different houses, and I was like, I'm never going to live here, 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 and here. And he was like, he's like, dude, like, they're cool areas. Like, nope, not going to happen. Like, there's going to be an economic decline in this area because of poor school systems, and there's going to be, their grid is set up just terribly. We want to be on a grid, the same hospital, the same electronic grid as the hospital, and all these different things, that these parameters that I put it in. The guy was just like, all right, dude, like, you tell me where you want to go. And I felt like he was like trash. So he got out of there. And then the next realtor that came in, I opened up a binder. Actually, it wasn't a binder. I opened up my laptop and I said, let me just go through this real quick with you and let you know these areas that we're willing to live in. And you fast forward, 3-4 years, and there's been several events in California, and yet, we haven't been impacted by them yet. We know what our potential disasters will be, and we're preparing for them, but we also can mitigate in a way that is logical, getting away from that doomsday prepper and saying, okay, like, this is just what's going to impact my community. How do I deal with that? Whether it's wildfires or whatever, you want to be able to mitigate those, those threats. So you're saying amazing things here. Talk about National Preparedness Month, really great advice. We talked about Japan a little bit, and so I kind of want to move on from that and talk about New Madrid, because I have been to so many exercises, whether I was in Fema at national level exercises, NLEs, or talking about those on teams, federal agencies. We're talking about that when I was sitting with different groups. I was with the Red Cross for a year. That wasn't even going to be close to New Madrid, but everybody always talks about that. And 1811 is the last time where I can really see like a real impact from there. Mm-hmm. What were some of the lessons learned from that disaster, and is it really that big of a threat now?
Yeah, so 1811 was a very long time ago. And that event, it was 3 separate large earthquakes in a 3-month period. So December through February. So it's winter for starters. So it's cold, probably windy, blizzardy, snowy. So anything that's going to, potentially impact your house or your heat, add winter in, and then it's cascading impact. That's a bigger issue. But, at the time, 1811, that area was incredibly rural. If you fast forward to now, the amount of infrastructure in that area is huge. And
St. Louis.
Yes. And so, if you remember the earthquake in DC a number of years ago, that, it was a small earthquake.
2012, 2013?
Yes.
Oh man,
I don't remember the year off the top of my head.
They didn't even know about the fault line, right? And then all of a sudden, boom, yeah.
Well, and the East Coast is very different from the West in that the West Coast has all of this glacial soil that sits on top of the land, essentially. So like your studio that you're in, you've got all the soft stuff on the wall to absorb the sound. So seismic waves and glacial soil, it makes it so that the waves can't travel very far. And that can make the impact, it can make local shaking higher, but the waves don't travel like that far. Whereas if you look at the New Madrid event or the DC area earthquake, that earthquake was felt up and down the seaboard. So New Madrid, the area that can experience shaking is so big because it's just bedrock. And so there's nothing there. It's just like the waves just are free to go wherever. And so you've got all of this infrastructure that isn't necessarily designed for earthquake shaking because of the incredibly low probability. And the soil zone doesn't necessarily trigger these higher requirements for shaking. So, it would be, an earthquake out there would be felt very widely. And, economically, it could be really bad.
And that raises a question, because we had an assumption, maybe you can correct our assumption, that if there was a Cascadia level event in Washington, that earthquake could potentially trigger, micro earthquakes throughout the state of Washington, where there's a ton of bridges cross earthquakes. I mean, that just kind of makes sense, fault lines, right? And so is that assumption true? If you had an earthquake on the edge of Washington, would you have earthquakes throughout the state?
I mean, there's certainly been instances of, if you push one thing, you have the potential for, causing other things to adjust. But I would say there's a very low probability of a Cascadia earthquake causing other faults to be triggered.
Oh, interesting. Well, good to know. I will let my master's program several years ago.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can reach out to my experts at the Pacific Seismic Network and the USGS and have them correct me. I would love to be woke on.
Please don't use that word. No, we're adults. We don't use that word. That's hilarious. Oh man, that's funny. Okay, so we've talked about a few disasters. I kind of want to get to a few more, but really the last one that I kind of want to really focus on, and it's kind of a funny one, but I think there's a ton of lessons learned actually, is the 79, yes, as in 79 AD, Pompeii Volcanic Eruption. I mean, talk about, there's been movies about it. Talk about a famous event. Why was it so famous? Is something like that likely to happen now? And what can we do to prepare for it?
Yeah. So the Pompeii volcanic eruption, so it's Mount Vesuvius. It's a volcano. And
way to get the name right, by the way.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, lots of I don't know why. Lots of people don't get that. I'm like, Mount Vesuvius. Yeah, well done. Yeah. Anyway, it's random.
So, what's interesting about that event is, it's famous for there's essentially like the casts of people, that died from what originally they thought was ashfall and pyroclastic flows. And there's relatively new studies actually show they died from heat before they were covered in ash. So you had a pyroclastic flow, which is just super heated, steam and ash coming out of the mountain, but because it's the ash is going to make that cloud heavier, so it kind of falls down and flows along the ground. So surviving that was not likely. It's hot, you can't breathe. The part of the reason that that civilization was even right there was because it was so fertile, and it was fertile because it's volcanic soil from eruptions. So that's why we live there. But we learned a lot about volcanic eruptions from that event. But what I think is so interesting is that if you go there today, people live up and down the sides of Mount Vesuvius. And at one point, the Italian government was trying to pay people to move because there's only one road in and out. And if there was a volcanic eruption, granted, in this day and age, there is so much science and monitoring of volcanoes that we're not going to go from 0 to 60. Like, we're going to see some small events and bulging and, rumblings beforehand. But you talk about evacuation and response planning. evacuating, hundreds of people, thousands of people off of a mountain, so there's going to be, emotions will be high, you'll have adrenaline, you've always got the people that don't believe it, that don't want to evacuate. So I think we learned about, what can happen in volcanic eruptions. And, we learned what can kill you, and we learned about ash fall and pyroclastic flows. But we apparently didn't learn that, like, the source of that is the volcano, and maybe we shouldn't live on it.
Yeah. But it's never happened to me, Amanda. I've never been taken out by a volcano before. Oh, gosh. Yeah, you talk about people who just don't believe disasters are coming. I really liked, we interviewed another guy on here about a month ago, and he said, if you wear your seatbelt and you don't get a car accident, were you like annoyed that you wore your seatbelt? And I thought that was such a great analogy. Like, it does you no good to say like, oh, it's not going to happen to me, or like, this isn't real. Like I can't see the pandemic. I don't see the RNA strand covered in fat on my fingers, because that's, what the strand is. And so it's like, well, of course you can't. Like, I don't know. We've been taking it super seriously, and it's disappointing when people aren't. But I would say that those people who are taking it seriously, like, you're still helping out. And the people who do evacuate, you make life much easier for a first responder. First responders have to put their lives at risk for people who don't take it seriously and who don't get out in time, which could potentially be two different groups there. But excellent point. Again, a lot of lessons learned about just understanding your hazards, and take the threats in your community seriously. Don't live by them, but don't live your life around them, but be aware of it and be conscious of those decisions, right? Our last topic before we get into the rapid fire is we want to talk about FEMA a little bit, because I was with FEMA on the national strike team, what we call the National Incident Management Assistance Team West at the time. I think they're called the IMAT Red now. I don't know. They keep rebranding. Either way, it's the National Strike Team per CAMERA, Voice Katrina Reform Act. You're at FEMA Region 10. You've been out there for a while doing a lot of really great work, obviously. And so can you tell us a little bit more about FEMA Region 10? It's located in the Northwest. What are some of the other complexities that you really have to deal with up there?
Yeah, so Region 10 is Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Alaska. And Alaska is much bigger than people realize. It's huge. And we have a lot of concerns about events. When events happen in Washington, for example, Alaska is very dependent on our port, because a lot of their goods come out of the port of Seattle. So one of the big Cascadia impacts that we've been concerned about is, well, if the Seattle port is damaged, then where does Alaska get its food shipments from? But I think Region 10 is just, we have so many different, hazards to deal with. So we have the earthquake hazards, we have, big rivers, we have flooding. Alaska has, ice breakups every year. Idaho gets ice breakups every year, which is where you get these big sheets of ice that, essentially dam the river and then cause flooding. We also have wildfires, you can't see out my window, I don't think, but it's just gray, hazy, everything smells burnt. The wildfires are just incredibly bad. We've got the tsunami hazard. We have landslides that are an issue every year. And if we have an earthquake in the winter, then we can have landslides from, caused by the earthquake. And then, we have, I don't know how many, we have 5 volcanoes in Washington State. I don't remember how many in Oregon and in Alaska. So, we have a lot of different hazards to deal with that have different impacts. And we also have, growing population. Like you mentioned, people are moving to the coasts. Boise has been like one of the fastest growing cities in the US. If you haven't been, you should check it out. It's actually a really cool city. But
Good plug for them.
anyway,
Yeah, we'll send this
yeah,
over to
right.
them.
I
Yeah,
mean, let's give
awesome.
Idaho some love.
Hey, why not? Yeah.
But I guess what I want to emphasize is, through this conversation, I feel like we get attention in the region to the hazards that we have, but too frequently that narrative is doom and gloom. That the Atlantic article about the big one about the Cascadia subduction zone a few years ago, like it just paints this picture of doom and gloom, which then makes people incredibly fatalistic. And they go, well, we're all going to die anyways, so why do anything about it?
That's an interesting perspective. I haven't thought about it before. Yeah, like,
and
might as well can't do anything about it. So yeah.
Talking to coastal communities in Washington about tsunami hazards, they make it sound like they're gonna like pull a move out of Titanic, like the old couple that just lays down in bed to sink with the ship.
Oh my gosh.
Like there's things you can do, and will it suck when it happens? Definitely. Like things are gonna be a mess, but like we can make it suck less if we act now. And I'm sure that FEMA's like, way to be articulate and represent the agency.
Hey, that's fine.
One,
hey, way to rock, right?
We can make it suck less. Like
you should coin that phrase, suck less mitigation.
Suck less. Yeah. Yes. So I just think that, yes, we have all of these hazards, but it's also like, that's what made this area so beautiful. That's why we have these mountains and rivers and the ocean. And, if we, are more proactive in the design and growth of our communities, we can build stronger, more resilient infrastructure so that, it sucks less when the earthquake happens.
Suck less. I like that so much. When we do a promo for you, maybe we'll just put like hashtag suck less on, yeah, that maybe that's not a bad idea. Okay. There could be some stupid joke there. So we're not going to do that. Let's see. Okay. So you talked about the Atlantic article a couple years ago about Cascadia, and people, I haven't really thought about that too much. I mean, I guess you see that in Florida, but Florida doesn't really go like that. They just think, oh, I've seen 100 of these, and so I'll be fine. This is a different perspective, right? Like, I'm going to die anyway, so whatever. Just, why spend money on this? That's where it really comes down to. It's why spend money on this? And so I guess my original question might have been, what makes you so nervous about Cascadia? And you kind of really hit on that really well. Don't be fatalistic. Address these concerns. Mitigation makes you suck less, or makes a disaster suck less, rather. Yeah. Yeah. So it's really important to note those things. Man, I just can't get past the idea that with high intensity, low frequency events, like that is the Northwest. When I think about that, even wildfires, you see a majority of the wildfires on the West Coast impacting probably California or areas of Alaska even that are really rural. They're not impacting huge communities. California, on the other hand, you see 100,000 people evacuated from Vacaville like 3 weeks ago. And so dealing with or living in a community, because you live out there, talking about gray skies, we've been bringing that in too. How do you manage personally, and some advice that you could give for other people? Hey, I live in an area that could see some huge impacts here. How do you stay calm and how do you deal with that? Is there a way to kind of process that emotionally?
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, not a psychologist, but yeah. Leslie Knope moment. How do you do that?
Well, so like, I guess for starters, so I've been working from home since March, and since March we had a large earthquake in Idaho that was kind of in a very lowly populated area, so there weren't any impacts there. But we had there was a big earthquake in Utah, which isn't Region 10, but I've been helping out Region 8 a lot with that. And COVID and earthquakes can coexist, and wildfires. And then we had a tsunami warning in Alaska. I have no sense of time anymore.
I know what you mean.
Recently
so
there was that, and like honestly, it's a lot working for FEMA. Especially, you get the emails of like every hurricane that's forming, and like, oh, it's moved west 2 degrees. Like, better email everybody. So it's honestly, it's very overwhelming. And just this week, I actually had to drop off of a webinar because I've started like just weeping at times. Like, I can't, it just happens and I can't stop it. And it's just like stress is just like trying to escape. But at the same time, I think what all of this is showing us, what all of these disasters is, what matters most is family and friends. And I'm really hoping that coming out of 2020, we can have a renewed focus on taking care of one another. And, like maybe we can figure out healthcare or childcare, and, that we focus more on protecting what matters rather than on economic growth. That's my opinion, not the agency's.
That's a good opinion.
But I think, just, and I think just being honest about it. I've found that the more people I tell that I'm, hanging on by a few threads at times, the more people are like, oh my God, I am too. It's really hard. And I think just by sharing what's going on and not always putting on a strong face is supportive. And, I know the wildfires are just adding a whole other element of terror to 2020. But there is an element of wildfires are part of a natural process. Wildfires are required to help some plants propagate and grow forests. So while it's scary because it's impacting our infrastructure and obviously like things are getting a little out of hand, there are benefits of wildfires as well. So, we're gonna be okay. We just have to adapt and, work on our own resilience. So, in terms of what people should do to be more prepared, since it is, Natural Preparedness Month, we know we have earthquakes that can happen. The first month of quarantine, I secured a big mirror that I have above my mantle. I put earthquake straps on it and secured it. And I was like, house projects. Yeah. I'm not going to die in an earthquake in my own house. That would be embarrassing. So, little things like that. The little baby latches to put on like cabinets so kids can open them.
Yes, I know very well.
Yeah. So those are actually really good for mitigating damages from earthquakes. After the earthquake in Alaska in 2018, so many people they lost all their dishes because when it shook, their cabinets opened and all the dishes just flew out. That's like a $4 fix. Do you want to spend a couple $100 on dishes and $1,000 on replacing your wood floors that are destroyed from all of your dishes? Or do you want to spend $4 on latches that are gonna annoy the hell out of you, but are gonna protect your dishes? So.
That's funny. Well,
so there's little things you can do, and I guess I would just I do want to mention in the concept of insurance, I guess, for preparedness. I have an elderly aunt that is she's independently living senior, and she's really struggling with the whole quarantine thing. She's a social person and is she's really struggling with the lack of social interactions, and she has this cabin in Oregon, and I was talking to her about the fires, and she goes, well, it's insured, I don't need to worry about it. And I just that might be kind of like an older generation way of thinking about things, but we also think that way about our cars, right? Like if we get in a wreck, well, it's insured, that's good. I think right now is a really good time to look into your homeowner's insurance policy and look and see what you're covered for. Homeowners insurance does not cover earthquakes, and
doesn't usually cover wildfires either.
Right. So looking into what am I covered for, that if that can give you peace of mind, that's not going to stop damage from happening, but in terms of your own, financial resilience, it's going to help out. So, I would just be aware of what you're covered for and what you're not. And if you have the financial means to get insurance, it's probably a good investment.
Yeah, for those who are listening and are like, oh, I need to look at that, under your policy, they're actually called acts of God. So if you go under acts of God in your policy, it will cover different disasters, and you might have an elective that you can add in. For example, wildfires. Wildfires are not usually covered. Another thing about that is just like going through all of your documentations. I would say that insurance is the number one thing you have to do when you're impacted by disaster. I always tell people, as soon as you're impacted by a disaster, the first thing you want to do is call your insurance company. You can tell your friends on Facebook later that you're okay. You can mark yourself okay. Like, go and file a claim, because when hundreds of thousands of people are filing a claim, it takes a lot of time, months, even years, to even get back those claims. And so a good call out there again about hey, forward thinking. You've had a lot of really great call outs, actually. So the last thing I want to ask about FEMA, you talked about some of the projects you've been doing at FEMA. We're, as an emergency managers in this community, listening to you, you've had so many great call outs, talk about personal preparedness, you talked about reaching out to communities. And if you're trying to do that, talk us through how FEMA is trying to help out communities and some of those activities that you found successful in your outreach that other emergency managers can apply.
Yeah, so FEMA, has done a ton, and outreach is really like my favorite thing to do. In case you haven't noticed, I like to talk. But FEMA spends, FEMA gets media attention for response efforts, right? But most of what FEMA does is actually moving money to state and local governments to help them prepare and to help them mitigate. Wow. Every community has, every state and every county should have a hazard mitigation plan. And a lot of those are funded by FEMA. And that's the effort that the community goes through to understand its hazard vulnerabilities and to determine what infrastructure is vulnerable and what they're going to do about it. And part of that process is supposed to involve a public education component, and or not necessarily public education, a public engagement. And so that that community, the citizens of that community should be engaged in that planning process. And I think most of the time that is done by the community putting a plan on their Facebook page and saying, provide comments, and this is my jam, but I'm not looking around Facebook pages to provide comments on plans.
Absolutely.
So I know, through my experience with FEMA, I worked with the city of Eugene, and they actually they did a disaster movie in the park, and so they had some booths set up to ask, to have maps and things of the city showing what's vulnerable, asking well, how should we fix it, or which projects should we prioritize? And the public could learn that the city is being proactive in its disaster preparedness, in its mitigation efforts. But then they made it fun by having, an outdoor movie showing of San Andreas. And,
of course. Going full circle here.
They had popcorn and everything. So it was great. So I think, FEMA does a lot that it doesn't get credit for in giving money to states and locals. And FEMA cannot do the community planning for the communities. That's up to the community. And so I guess I would say, as an advocate for FEMA here, if you're a community emergency manager and you want help with that planning process, we're here to provide technical assistance and help give you ideas. And, the movie in the park in Eugene was, I was teaching a class on mitigation planning, and I just kind of threw out there, if somebody wants to do a disaster movie night, I will come down there on my own dollar and help you with it. But
Awesome.
like, how do we make this cool? Green building, and, LEED certification is, sexy in sustainability. Like, how do we make disaster mitigation cool? We have all these disaster movies that everybody loves. Like, let's leverage that somehow. So there's a lot of ways to improve community engagement and make it meaningful. I think so frequently I hear people complain about hazard mitigation plans and how it's just checking the box. And it's like, well, FEMA has requirements, but it's your plan. Like, make the plan useful for you. We're actually not interested in the plan itself. We want documentation of the process that you've gone through. And I think that's lost in translation oftentimes. So FEMA is doing a lot of good work, despite what we're often portrayed as in the media. And, I guess I just want to throw out that, like, especially through our new program, we have a new grant program called BRIC. It's building is a resilient infrastructure in communities. And it's this huge, multi-million-dollar pot of money that is for communities to build and update, retrofit infrastructure to make it more resilient. And so it's really up to local communities and state government to apply for those funds.
Talking about emergency management, trying to be cool. You know what's cool? The Disaster Tough podcast is pretty cool.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah, thanks. So that's a good point, because I've been trying to push very hard on getting people away from doomsday prepping, which, if you talk to anybody with, how do I even say this? Like, at any level of intellect, as soon as you start talking about disasters, the number one thing is like, oh, I don't want to deal with doomsday prepping. Like, okay, like, I understand that's perception. We're not talking about militias here. We're not talking about building bunkers under the ground. We're talking about building codes, and we're talking about understanding the hazards that are in your community. We're talking about evacuation routes. We're talking about, sustainability and working with your environment. Those are all logical things. Insurance, that is the most logical thing you can think of. And so, like, just to walk through that, what's cool? Not dying is pretty cool. What's cool is like, oh, there's a hurricane, but I could watch it on the news and I was totally fine. Or there's a wildfire and wow, that's really powerful to watch nature do its thing. I'm okay. That's cool. It's not cool to be in a shelter and to saying, okay, I don't have any of my documents. I don't have any of my family pictures. I'm worried about my dog, Zoe. Maybe that was too specific. Whatever it is, that's not cool and it's not fun. And I don't think anybody who has lived through that will ever say like, oh, I'm glad I did that. Maybe they'll say I'm grateful for the lessons learned, but you don't want to deal with loss of life. So great call outs there and great things about FEMA. I do think that counties are starting to change. This is going to be a plug. Counties are starting to change how they're doing hazard mitigation plans, because Doberman Emergency Management, of which I own, we really focus on applying data to communities, making customized plans, getting away from like that cookie cutter, like checking the boxes. And as we've been working with different counties of that, the first response is like, well, we don't think we can get, or we don't think we're going to be working with multi-million-dollar mitigation programs. And it's like, no, that's not about this. This is not about that. This is about, hey, did you know an early warning system that you can apply for a grant for from the federal government could help out the people evacuate a wildfire or an earthquake or, whatever, tsunami. And then like starting to roll that back and like putting them into the scale that matches their community. It's not always these $100 million projects. They are sometimes community outreach, activity nights, that engagement. And so just understanding how that works and the data behind that, how it can help them. We talk about active shooter training and the people with training and versus people without training and how they've responded to disasters. It really shows the impact of just understanding your disaster and what to do in your disaster. So plug for Doberman, but great call out too about understanding people and working with people. So our last section, we've kept you on pretty long, but you've had really great comments. And so what we're going to do really quick is rapid fire, just really quick responses. One of those stupid, posting a picture, no explanation, no whatever things that you see, that kind of level of detail here. So let's just jump into this last section, rapid fire. Name the top 3 engineering projects that impresses you the most about the mitigation efforts within Region 10.
Sure. So I already talked about tsunami vertical evacuation projects, so I'm not going to talk about those.
Okay.
I do want to do a shout out to Washington Department of Transportation replaced the Alaskan Way Viaduct. It was this double-decker structure that was pretty much an exact replica of the Cypress Street Viaduct that collapsed in the '89 Loma Prieta earthquake. So it's taken years, but they replaced it. They made a tunnel that is, seismically safe. They've looked at, earthquake and tsunami potentials for that. So such a cool infrastructure and engineering project. And then I guess for my number 3, not in Region 10, but the LDS church, or the Mormon Temple in Salt Lake City, is currently undergoing a base isolation project, which is where they put the entire structure on like these big, essentially like rollers. So when an earthquake happens, the structure will be safe. So they're actually like scaffolding the entire temple and holding it in place so that they can dig out underneath it and put it on base isolators. So just like epic feat of engineering, so cool. And, and asking them why they're doing that, they're like, well, why wouldn't we? We want the structure to be around forever. And I was like,
that's awesome. That's a great answer.
So cool. So, like shout out to Utah for that. And it's funny, I actually realized I was using my Utah mug this morning.
Oh my gosh, you have like all these product placements. So your Utah mug, your like water bottle, your book. That's awesome. For those who don't know, the LDS Church is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They have a lot of engineering projects. They want their stuff to last, right? And so that's really cool. I've been through obviously Salt Lake, as I've talked about before, because I worked with Red Cross, and to have them go through and to really take care of the things that they build. I mean, they understand that they live. We worked with the governor and the governor's office for the state of Utah, and the major highway, I believe, is I-15. I could be wrong, but the major highway that goes through Salt Lake, it would basically become an island because it goes right through where there's 2 major fault lines. And so they've taken a lot of effort of not just securing infrastructure, but also the LDS Church has done so much on community planning and working with the partners out there. Within their church alone, Utah is very well prepared. In fact, another big shout out to Utah is we were talking about homelessness before. They were the first state to end chronic homelessness, which basically means if you're homeless for more than a year, the state took all the funds that were going to go to hospitals and jails and partnered with private companies, and they built long-term housing that provided a social worker, which gave them access to, medical and health, and be able to get a bank account so they get a job. And they treat homelessness like a mental health issue. And they were able to reduce their cost by like half. This was like 10, 15 years ago. And so big shout out to them for emergency preparedness efforts on those levels. So getting away from rapid fire, but cool. Yeah, really cool study. That was what I argued. The reason why I know that is that's what I argued for that theoretical back in the day when I said, hey, if you have 11,000 homeless people, what do you do? And I actually did some research, and it was Utah that popped up. Okay, so what are 5 things that people should do inside their homes to be earthquake safe? You named one, right, with the baby latches. So what are the other 4?
Secure the heavy stuff. You know, if you've got TVs, mirrors, you know, like bookcases that aren't built in. Earthquake straps are really cheap. You just anchor them to the wall. Secure your hot water heater is important. I feel like most modern homes have that done already, but you know, if your hot water heater falls over, not only can you have a flood, but you know, just bad in general. Secure that.
Yeah, that would suck. Yeah. Suck less. Yeah.
Yes, make it suck less. Secure the hot water heater. If you have a chimney, you know, especially if it's a brick chimney, bracing that is really important. In an earthquake, that chimney, it can either fall down and like off the house, you know, in which case you don't have a chimney and hopefully there's nobody walking by, but it can also fall into the house, and, you know, do some significant roof damage and, you know, kill somebody. So brace your chimney. And then, you know, consider earthquake retrofits and earthquake insurance. So earthquake retrofits, modern seismic building codes really didn't exist until like the 1980s. So if you're in a home that was built before then, the most common thing is that in an earthquake, the home will slide off of the foundation. And it's really not that big of an issue to fix. Like it's not that hard to fix. And I want to say it's between like $5,000 and $15,000, depending on where you're at, as opposed to if you're in an earthquake and that house slides off the foundation, you know, any piping connection that you have is gone. Like the entire house can just be destroyed. So, you know, think about that short-term investment for long-term benefits on that one.
Awesome. Okay, what's your favorite animal?
A bison, actually.
What?
Like a buffalo, yeah.
Yeah, I know what a bison. Oh, like a buffalo. Oh. Okay,
They're incredibly strong, resilient creatures. They were almost extinct in the U.S. We've brought them back. They're like the national park logo. They're amazing creatures.
Okay, I thought you were gonna say, being Leslie Knope, I thought you were gonna say mini horse, which is actually my favorite animal. But then you said bison.
My karaoke name is Lil Sebastian.
I'm offended by that. That's. Oh, it's like a buffalo. Okay. Okay. Well, that's like the level of weird I would suspect from Leslie Knope.
Yeah.
So that's cool. My favorite animal for a long time was a walrus. So who knows? Yeah, super random. Okay. Talk about rumor control. Just for the final sake, you know, for everybody to hear verbatim, should you hide in a doorway, under a doorway, or not in an earthquake?
No.
Thank you. Yes. I appreciate The Rock going on to oh my gosh, who was it? It was like nighttime television, and he was promoting earthquake safety after San Andreas, and he was trying to do his best. But then he was like, "Yeah, you should definitely hide under a doorway," and I was like, "No."
And also, like, for the record, no triangle of life. That's don't do that. And don't run outside either. Like, that's running outside is bad. That's where things are flying and falling. Don't run outside. Drop cover and hold on. And I guess one little plug. The Great Shakeout is October 15th at 10:15 a.m. in your time zone. And so while you're at home, because we all are at home now because of COVID, drop cover and hold on at home. Where would you do that? And what might fall on you? And, you know, fix it so it doesn't fall on you. Make it suck less.
We chose the wrong date. We chose the wrong date to do your episode. What? October 15th? Okay. Well, now you give people a heads up. This is emergency planning, so that works.
Okay. And you know what? I would love to do, you know, I can help you out with some stuff for on the day of shakeout.
Awesome.
We can do a disaster tough shakeout.
That's awesome. Let's do that. Okay, very cool. So, what is the most important thing in life? Friends, waffles, or work? You better get this order right because you're the Leslie Knope of disasters.
Can I say yes? All three?
Ooh, that's pretty close, but ooh, okay. I think she said it's friends, but Waffles and work are pretty close.
Well, I would say my work is with friends, and Waffles fit in anywhere, right? So.
Oh, that's a good point. Okay, that's fair. It's fair. Okay, if an emergency manager wants to learn more about FEMA Region 10 earthquake, tsunami, or volcano risk and mitigation, where can they go to learn more?
So FEMA's site, ready.gov, is really the best jumping off point to learning more about the different programs that support mitigation and learning about hazards. There's a lot of resources on there for National Preparedness Month as well. So I would definitely check out ready.gov. But if you want to learn more about earthquakes specifically, USGS's page is great, and they actually they have a really cool Twitter account that's at USGS_quakes, where they tweet out about ongoing earthquake sequences, hazards, and history and things like that.
Awesome. Yeah, so make sure you follow those things. And as an emergency manager myself, even though I've done a ton of research and do this on the daily, I also still use those resources, especially ready.gov. And to always make sure that, you're following current best practice. And so great resources to call out there. So last question, obviously the most important question of the podcast. What is the best podcast for emergency managers?
So I think legally I have to say the FEMA podcast.
Oh my gosh. This whole episode is a waste.
I know, it's a waste. You've wasted your time. But I think what you're doing with the Disaster Tough podcast on getting emergency managers to actually talk about the philosophy behind what we do and, get away from checking the boxes I think what you're doing is absolutely wonderful. But I also, just because, I'm such a fangirl of the Beyonce of earthquakes, Lucy Jones recently started her own podcast called Getting Through It, where she talks about earthquakes, and she's talked about COVID, and she's really great at talking about taking scientific data and making it publicly accessible. And then my last one, just because I'm a super nerd, there's this podcast called Ologies, Ologies, and she interviews just subject matter experts in their fields, and it's super fun, exciting, and she's interviewed, her first episode is with a volcanologist, so someone who studies volcanoes, and they talk about the science to disasters, everything like that. But even there was an episode on museology or museum, like somebody who works in museums. And this was a few years ago, but he ran a museum in California and was talking about having to have an emergency plan for all the artifacts in the museum and taking everything out because of the wildfires that were coming through, and then having the recovery plan in place to put everything back. And just, the world of emergency management, it interfaces with everything, right? Because if a disaster happens, it's interrupting the fabric of everything. And I think, hearing about these other subject matter experts that are doing good work in their fields, and hearing, that they care about what they're doing. And so they're trying to be, they want to make sure it stays around for forever. So I just throw that out there too, is like another good one. But for the record, Disaster Tough is really cool, and I really
you
do
nailed
like
that question. That's funny. The great thing about editing is I could just edit everything else and just, no, I won't do that. Seriously, Amanda, thank you so much for coming onto our podcast, for sharing your insights. You talked to us way longer than we asked you to talk to us from FEMA, but you gave us so many great inputs, and again, we're really grateful. If you liked what Amanda was saying today, which we definitely liked, so make sure you like it too. The way you can do that is to give us a 5-star rating of this episode and subscribe to the Disaster Tough podcast. You can also follow us on the Disaster Tough podcast Instagram page, where we're going to be posting a little bit about Amanda and the great work she's been doing there. And if you have comments, questions, and you want to follow up more about what she was talking about, either put a comment on those posts on social media. Again, that's Instagram at Disaster Tough Podcast, or you can send us an email at info@dobermanemg.com. Again, that's info@dobermaneng.com.